to this, the 13th session of our study of the book of Genesis. In this session, we will read chapters 38, 39, 40, and 41. We read the story of Judah and Tamar. We find Joseph working in the household of the high chamberlain Potiphar. He's falsely accused and thrown into prison, where his ability to solve dreams eventually allows him access to Pharaoh. But first, let's pray. O God, our Father, open our eyes and enlighten our minds as we study your word. So grant that our minds may know your truth, and our hearts may feel your love, and then confirm and strengthen our wills that we may go out to live what we have learned. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. So this episode of Judah and Tamar in chapter 38 first demonstrates the growth of Judah as a character who is central to the entire Joseph narrative. Already in chapter 37, he had demonstrated active leadership, albeit in a questionable cause. There he actually saved Joseph's life, in contrast to Reuben's unsuccessful and ultimately self-centered rescue attempt. As the one who basically assumes responsibility, he will be made to undergo an inner development, and again be the one to take charge of the youngest son, Benjamin. The missing piece that begins to explain his nobility in this regard is the chapter we're getting ready to read. So we're going to start with verses 1 through 7, chapter 38. And it happened at this time that Judah went down from his brothers and pitched his tent by an Adullamite named Hira. And Judah saw there the daughter of a Canaanite man named Shua. And he took her and came to bed with her. And she conceived and bore a son and called his name And she conceived again and bore a son and called his name Onan. And she bore still another son and called his name Shelah. And he was at Shezeb when she bore him. And Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. And Judah's firstborn, was evil in the eyes of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. So the story of Judah and his son spans over 20 years. It reads as though this narrative began immediately after Joseph was sold into Egypt. The larger story indicates that the early phases of the Judah narrative was well before Joseph's enslavement. This is not just an interruption of the real story, but as we follow the overall narrative, we will see how well it fits at this point. Judah went down, it starts. He went down from the high country to the coastal plains to the west, an area inhabited by the Canaanites. Going down might, in other circumstances, mean going down south toward Egypt. The next chapter begins with Joseph was taken down to Egypt. In verse 7, it says, was evil in the eyes of the Lord. We don't know what he did that was so terrible. But he was the firstborn after all, and they typically haven't fared well in these stories. We go on with 8 through 11. And Judah said to Onan, "Come to bed with your brother's wife, and do your duty as brother-in-law for her, and raise up seed for your brother." And Onan knew that the seed would not be his, so when he would come to bed with his brother's wife, he would waste his seed on the ground, so to give no seed to his brother. And what he did was evil in the eyes of the Lord, and he put him to death as well. And Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, "Stay a widow in your father's house until Shelah, my son, is grown up." For he thought, lest he too die like his brothers. And Tamar went and stayed at her father's house. So there was this legal obligation of the closest brother in order of birth to impregnate the widow of his childless brother. The deceased brother would be allowed biological continuity, and his wife could produce progeny. Onan didn't want his brother to get credit for what was actually his child, so he spent his seed on the ground. Judah had lost 2 sons now in a relatively short period of time. In contrast to Jacob's demonstration of grief at the loss of Joseph, we don't hear anything about Judah's emotional response to these losses. Maybe it was there, and maybe we just don't hear about it, but it's not there. We don't see it. Go on with 12 through 23. And a long time passed, and the daughter of Shua, Judah's wife, died. And after the mourning period, Judah went up to the sheep shearers, and he was with Hera, the Adullamite, his friend, to Timnah. And Tamar was told, saying, Look, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep. And she took off her widow's garb and covered herself with a veil and wrapped herself and sat by the entrance to Anaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah had grown up, and she had not been given to him as wife. And Judah saw her, and he took her for a whore, for she had covered her face. And he turned aside to her by the road and said, Here, pray, let me come to bed with you. For he knew not that she was his daughter-in-law. And she said, What would you give me for coming to bed with me? And he said, I personally will send a kid from the flock. And she said, Only if you give a pledge till you send it. And he said, What pledge shall I send you? And she said, Your seal and cord, and the staff in your hand. And he gave them to her, and he came to bed with her, and she conceived by him. And she rose and went her way, and took off the veil she was wearing, and put on her widow's garb. And Judah sent the kid by the hand of his friend, the Adullamite, to take back the pledge from the woman's hand. And he did not find her. And he asked the men in the place, saying, Where is the colt harlot, the one at Emnon by the road? And they said, There has been no colt harlot here. And he returned to Judah and said, I could not find her. And the men of the place said as well, There has been no colt harlot here. And Judah said, Let her take them, lest we be a laughingstock. Look, I sent this kid, and you could not find her. Sheep shearing was an occasion for elaborate festivities. Judah was finished with mourning for his wife, and maybe was in the holiday mood. Verse 13 says he went up the opposite of going down that we had in verse 1. Tamar knows that it is long past time when she should have been given to Shelah as husband, so she has her own strategy. She is sitting by the entrance of Enam, which probably means twin wells. But instead of a betrothal type scene where the bridegroom meets his future bride at the well, Tamar is here for business. She is dressed as a prostitute. The discussion we hear is a goods for services business dialogue. We can contrast Judah's action here with Joseph's sexual restraint in the next chapter. But we notice that Tamar is not only getting justice for herself, she asks for a pledge that she can use for evidence in the paternity of the child she may conceive. The promised payment is a kid from the flock, a reminder of the kid that was slaughtered so that Judah and his brothers could deceive their father. The seal she asked for was a cylindrical seal attached to a cord, usually worn around the neck. It was used for affixing a kind of signature. The staff was more a symbol of authority. This would have been like asking for your driver's license and your credit cards. We go on with 24 through 26. And it happened about 3 months later that Judah was told, saying, Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has played the whore, and what's more, she's conceived by her whoring. And Judah said, Take her out to be burned. Out she was taken, when she sent to her father-in-law, saying, By the man to whom these belong, I have conceived. And she said, Recognize, pray, whose are this seal and cord and this staff? And Judah recognized them, and he said, She is more in the right than I, for have I not failed to give her to Shelah my son? And he knew her again no more. Judah apparently has jurisdiction over his daughter-in-law, even though he has returned her to her father. He gives her a death sentence immediately without the slightest reflection or call for evidence. He hears the rumor and says, Take her out to be burned. It's like a trap suddenly sprung closed. We immediately see the connection with the story in the last chapter of the deception of Jacob by his sons. Just like Judah and his brothers, Tamar sends evidence to argue her case, but this time it's true evidence. Recognize, pray, whose are this seal and cord? recognize, pray, is this your son's tunic? Judah concedes that he has behaved unjustly toward Tamar. We go on with 38, 27 through 30. And it happened at the time she gave birth that, look, there were twins in her womb. And it happened as she gave birth that one put out his hand, and the midwife took it and bound a scarlet thread on his hand, to say, this one came out first. And he was drawing back his hand. Look, out came his brother. And she said, what a breach you have made for yourself. And she called his name Perez. And afterward out came his brother, on whose hand was the scarlet thread. And she called his name Zerah. The twins, of course, remind us of Jacob and Esau, the whole chain of brothers struggling over the rights of the firstborn. Perez will become the father of the kings of Judah. The scarlet thread in the hands of Zerah associates him with Esau the red. What was at stake here, as the audience of the 6th century will understand, is not merely the line of one of the brothers, but the line which will lead to royalty. King David was a descendant of Perez. Judah here learns what it was like to lose sons and to want desperately to protect the youngest. Although his failure to marry Tamar off to his youngest son leads to public humiliation, his response shows that he immediately accepts blame. Only after we have been informed of Judah's change can the story resume with chapter 39. True to biblical thinking, redemption may start only after the crime has been punished. The chronology works out well here. We are told in chapter 41 that about 20 years elapsed between the sale of Joseph and his meeting with his other brothers in Egypt. Since Judah was quite possibly a father already in chapter 37, the story we just read could have ended just before the events of chapter 33. In other words, Judah reaches his full maturity just in time. We go on with chapter 39. This chapter is a completely symmetrical episode. The introductory frame that we are about to read is echoed by a closing frame, verses 20 through 23. The central story is closely linked to the two frames by several recurring thematic words. Those words to look for in this story are all, hand, house, blessing, and succeed. So we start with verses 1 through 6. This is the opening frame. And Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, courtier of Pharaoh, the high chamberlain, an Egyptian man, bought him from the hands of the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he was in the house of this Egyptian master. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that all that he did the Lord made succeed in his hand. And Joseph found favor in his eyes, and he ministered to him. And he put him in charge of his house and all that he had, and he placed in his hands. And it happened from the time he put him in charge of his house and of all he had, that the Lord had blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the Lord's blessing was on all that he had in the house and field. And he left all that he had in Joseph's hands, and he gave no thought to anything with him, there save the bread he ate. And Joseph was comely in features and comely to look at. So did you hear all the key words in that frame? At the end of verse 6, we read, and Joseph was comely in features and comely to look at. Those were the exact words used to describe Joseph's mother, Rachel, in chapter 29, verse 17. But they immediately create a problem for Joseph in his stewardship of all that is in the house. We go on with 7 through 10. And it happened after these things that his master's wife raised her eyes to Joseph and said, lie with me. And he refused. And he said to his master's wife, look, my master has given no thought with me here to what is in this house. And all that he has placed in my hands. He is not greater in this house than I. And he has held back nothing from me except you, as you are his wife. And how could I do this great evil and give offense to God? And so she spoke to Joseph day after day, and he would not listen to her, to lie by her, to be with her. Come lie with me is just 2 words in Hebrew. Joseph responds with a monologue that is 35 words long in Hebrew. This is called contrastive dialogue. It's used by biblical writers to define the difference between characters in verbal confrontation. So she responds by suggesting that he simply lie down in bed next to her. He's still not buying this. We go on with verse 11 through 19. And it happened on one such day that he came into the house to perform his task. And there was no man of the men of the house there in the house. And she seized him by his garment, saying, Lie with me. And he left his garment in her hand, and he fled and went out. And so when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and fled outside, she called out to the people of the house and said to them, saying, See, he has brought us a Hebrew man to play with us. He came into me to lie with me, and I called out in a loud voice, and so when he heard me raise my voice and call out, he left his garment by me and fled and went out. And she laid out his garment by her until his master returned to the house. And she spoke to him things of this sort, saying, The Hebrew slave came into me when you brought us to play with me, whom you brought us to play with me. And so when I raised my voice and called out, he left his garment by me and fled outside. And it happened when his master heard his wife's words, which she spoke to him, saying, Things of this sort your slave has done to me, he became incensed. When it says up front that there are no other men in the house, it means there are no other people in the house, men or women, no household servants there. When all the people show up, she complains that they should all be insulted that her husband has put this barbarian foreigner in charge of the house. When she says, he came into me, she is playing on a double meaning for this phrase. All she is actually saying that as he came into the house or chamber or whatever, wherever she was alone, she knew it could be inferred by her listeners, however, that she meant consummated sexual relations with her. So we go on with 20 through 23, through the end of the chapter. And Joseph's master took him and placed him in the prison house, the place where the king's prisoners were held. And he was there in the prison house, and God was with Joseph and extended kindness to him and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison house warden. And the prison house warden placed in Joseph's hands all the prisoners who were in the prison house, and all that they had to do there, it was he who did it. The prison house warden had to see to nothing that was in his hands, as the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made succeed. So in this closing frame, we find Joseph again inside a house. This time it's a prison house where he will take charge. The last part of verse 20 mirrors the last part of verse 2, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master, and there he was in the prison house. We hear again that God was with Joseph and he found favor, this time in the eyes of the prison house warden, where earlier it was in the eyes of the Egyptian master. The warden places in Joseph's hands all the prisoners, and the warden, whatever he did, the Lord made succeed. Key words. We saw those all the way through here. Now we go on to chapter 40. I'll start with verse 1 through 4. And it happened after these things that the cupbearer of the king of Egypt, and his baker gave offense to the Lord, and the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was furious with his 2 courtiers, the chief cupbearer and his chief baker, and he put them under guard in the house of the high chamberlain, the prison house, the place where Joseph was held. And the high chamberlain assigned Joseph to them, and he ministered to them, and they stayed a good while under guard. On verse 4 it says that Joseph is assigned to minister to the 2 courtiers that Pharaoh has thrown into prison. This doesn't necessarily contradict what we read at the end of chapter 39, that Joseph was in charge of the whole prison. These guys are just getting special treatment. After all, they are courtiers to Pharaoh. They're just not any kind of bones that just got thrown into prison. The high chamberlain here is telling Joseph what to do, not the warden. Perhaps the high chamberlain is some kind of a minister of justice. Again, we don't know exactly. And the prison warden perhaps reports to him. It's not entirely clear. We go on with verse 5 through 7. And the two of them dreamed a dream, each his own dream, on a single night, each dream with its own solution. And the cupbearer and the baker to the king, who were held in the prison house. And Joseph came to them in the morning and saw them, and look, they were frowning. And he asked Pharaoh's courtiers who were with him under the guard in the Lord's house, saying, "Why are your faces downcast today?" Robert Alter uses the term solution instead of interpretation in explaining this dream in his translation. There is one exclusive decoding for every dream, and a person who is granted insight can break that code. That's just thinking on this one. So we'll see where we normally you'd expect to see interpretation, and maybe in your Bibles, here we're going to see solution. We go to 8 through 15. And they said to him, "We dreamed a dream, and there is no one to solve it." And Joseph said to him, "Are not solutions from God? Pray recount them to me." And the chief cupbearer recounted his dream to Joseph and said to him, "In my dream, and look, a vine was before me, and on the vine were 3 tendrils. And as it was building, its blossoms shot up, its clusters ripened to grapes. And Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and crushed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I placed the cup in Pharaoh's palm." And Joseph said, "This is the solution. The 3 tendrils are 3 days. 3 days hence Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your place, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, as you used to do when you were his cup holder. But if you remember, I was with you once it goes well for you. Do me the kindness, pray, mention me to Pharaoh, and bring me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen from the land of the Hebrews, and here too I have done nothing that I should have been put in the pit." Joseph remains a good monotheist. In Egypt, there were schools called houses of life that gave instruction in dream interpretation. He simply asks, are not all solutions from God? It's not really clear whether this means that all dreams come from God along with the interpretation or solution, or the dream comes from somewhere else and God just provides the interpretation. At any rate, Joseph immediately attempts to interpret the dreams. The only difficult part of this dream is probably the meaning of the 3 tendrils, which he determines are 3 days. At the end of this section, Joseph asks the wine steward to remember him to Pharaoh and refers to having been put in the pit. By pit, he clearly means jail or prison, but the writer uses the opportunity to remind his readers of Joseph being thrown into the pit by his brothers. We go on with 16 through 19. And the chief baker saw that he had solved well, and he said to Joseph, "I too in my dream, and look, there were 3 open work baskets on my head, and in the topmost were all sorts of food from Pharaoh, baker's ware, and birds were eating from the basket over my head." And Joseph answered and said, "This is his solution. The 3 baskets are 3 days. 3 days hence Pharaoh will lift up your head from upon you and impale you on a pole, and the birds will eat your flesh from upon you." Didn't turn out quite as well. In the end, the cupbearer goes back to work, and the baker loses his head. The 2 dreams here parallel Joseph's 2 dreams in chapter 37. The first relates to agriculture, the second uses the sky. But the sky in the baker's dream consists mostly of birds eating from the baker's basket over his head. Remember that Joseph uses the same language for both of these dreams. For the cup holder, he says, "Pharaoh will lift up your head." For the baker, he says, Pharaoh will lift up your head from upon you. We go on with 20 through 23. And it happened on the third day, Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast for all his servants. And he lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker in the midst of his servants. And he restored the chief cupbearer to his cupbearing, and he put the cup in Pharaoh's hand. And the chief baker he impaled, just as Joseph had solved it for them. But the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph. No, he forgot him. Remembering will be a central key to the larger story of Joseph and his brothers when we see them again. Memory will play a large role. And we go on with chapter 41. And verse 1 through 8. And it happened in the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh dreamed, and look, he was standing by the Nile, and look, out of the Nile came up 7 cows, fair to look at, and fat in flesh, and they grazed in the rushes. And look, another 7 cows came up after them out of the Nile, foul to look at, and meager in flesh, and stood by the cows on the bank of the Nile. And the foul-looking, meager-fleshed cows ate up the 7 fair-looking fat cows, and Pharaoh awoke. And he slept and dreamed a second time, and look, 7 ears of grain came up on a single stalk, fat and goodly. And look, 7 meager ears, blasted by the east wind, sprouted after them. And the meager ears swallowed the 7 fat and full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and look, it was a dream. And it happened in the morning that his heart pounded, and he sent and called all the soothsayers of Egypt, and all its wise men. And Pharaoh recounted to them his dream, but none could solve them for Pharaoh. 2 years goes by, Pharaoh has a dream. He was standing by the Nile. Given the Nile's importance as the source of Egypt's fertility, it was appropriate that Pharaoh would be standing by the Nile in his dream about plenty and famine. We hear the first set of cows were grazing, but the second set just came up and stood there for a moment. Then they quickly ate up the fat cows. This is a kind of nightmare that could be expected to wake Pharaoh up. In verse 6, the meager ears of grain are blasted by the east wind coming off the hot, parching desert. There are no sheaves bowing in this nightmare, and Pharaoh wakes up again. This time, his heart is pounding. After listening to his soothsayers' explanations of the dream, Pharaoh is not satisfied with their interpretation. Again, we notice there is a pair of dreams, not 1 or 3, but 2. We go on with 9 through 13. And the chief cupbearer spoke to Pharaoh, saying, My offenses I recall today. Pharaoh had been furious with his servants, and he placed me under guard in the house of the high chamberlain, me and the chief baker. And we dreamed a dream on that same night. He and I, each of us dreamed a dream with its own solution. And there was with us a Hebrew lad, a slave of the high chamberlain. And we recounted to him, and he solved our dreams, each of us according to his dream. He solved it. And it happened just as he had solved it for us, so it came about. Me he restored to my post, and him he impaled. Now the chief cupbearer remembers the Hebrew lad who solves dreams. We go on with 14 through 16. And Pharaoh sent and called for Joseph, and they hurried him from the pit. And he shaved and changed his garments and came before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I dreamed a dream, and none can solve it. And I have heard about you that you can understand a dream to solve it. And Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, Not I. God will answer for Pharaoh's well-being. Joseph cleaned himself up to be presentable before Pharaoh. It says that he shaved. In ancient Near East, only Egyptians were clean-shaven. He may have also shaved his head, which was another distinctive Egyptian practice. 1:17 through 32. And Pharaoh spoke to Joseph, "In my dream, here I was standing on the bank of the Nile, and look, out of the Nile came up 7 cows, fat in flesh and fair in feature. And they grazed in the rushes. And look, another 7 cows came up after them, gaunt and very foul-featured and meager in flesh. I had not seen their like in all the land of Egypt for foulness. And the meager, foul cows ate up the first 7 fat cows, and they were taken into their bellies. And you could not tell that they had come into their bellies, for their looks were as foul as before. And I woke. And I saw in my dream, and look, 7 ears of grain came up on a single stalk, full and goodly. And look, 7 shriveled, meager ears, blasted by the east wind, sprouted after them. And the meager ears swallowed the 7 goodly ears. And I spoke to my soothsayers, and none could tell me the meaning. And Joseph said to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's dream is one. What God is about to do, he has told Pharaoh. The 7 goodly cows are 7 years, and the 7 ears of grain are 7 years. The dream is one. And the 7 meager and foul cows who came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 meager ears of grain blasted by the east wind will be 7 years of famine. It is just as I said to Pharaoh. What God is about to do, he has shown Pharaoh. Look, 7 years are coming of great plenty through all the land of Egypt, and 7 years of famine will arise after them, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. And the famine will ravage the land, and you will not be able to tell there was plenty in the land because of that famine afterward, for it will be very grave. And the repeating of the dream to Pharaoh 2 times, this means that the thing has been fixed by God, and God is hastening to do it. Pharaoh recounts the dreams almost verbatim, the way the narrator had described them. Virtually the only difference is Pharaoh is expressing his own personal horror with this. Joseph begins by explaining the dreams are one. They both tell the same story. God in the dreams is telling Pharaoh what he is going to do, and it's going to be famine. 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine. We go on with 33 through 45. And so let Pharaoh look out for a discerning wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. And let Pharaoh do this, appoint overseers for the land, and muster the land of Egypt in the 7 years of plenty, and let them collect all the food in those good years that are coming, and let them pile up grain under Pharaoh's hand, food in the cities to keep under guard. And the food will be a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine, which will be in the land of Egypt, that land that may not perish in the famine. And the thing seemed good in Pharaoh's eyes, and in the eyes of his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, Could we find a man like him in whom the Spirit of God, whom is the Spirit of God? And Pharaoh said to Joseph, After God has made known to you all this, there is none as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and by your lips all my folk shall be guided. By the throne alone shall I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and had him clothed in fine linen clothes, and placed the golden collar around his neck. And he had him ride in the chariot of his viceroy, and they called out before him, Abrekah, setting him over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh. Without you no man shall raise hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphenath-Paneah, and he gave him Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, as wife. And Joseph went out of the land of Egypt. So after the dreams were interpreted or solved, Pharaoh didn't ask for any advice, but Joseph gave him advice anyway. He had figured out a way to design his own job. He explains that everything will be under Pharaoh's hand, meaning that it will actually be under the control of a discerning wise man that Pharaoh must find. Pharaoh hasn't been turned into a monotheist, but he has gone along with the idea that human wisdom is a gift of God. Joseph mostly listens as Pharaoh develops his plan for Joseph to be set over the land of Egypt. In verse 44, where Pharaoh says, "I am Pharaoh, without you no man shall raise hand or foot," means something like, "By the power invested in me as Pharaoh, I declare that without you," etc., etc., etc. So Joseph is also given an Egyptian name, Zaphenath Panah, and an Egyptian wife, Asenath, who is the daughter of a priest. We go on with 46 through 49. And Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and passed through all the land of Egypt. And the land in the 7 years of plenty made gatherings. And he collected all the food of the 7 years that were in the land of Egypt. And he placed food in the cities. The food from the fields round each city he placed within it. And Joseph piled up grain like the sand of the sea very much until he ceased counting, for it was beyond count. There's a little bit of a repetition here. 45b through 46 are from the P source. So after Pharaoh has given Joseph a wife, 45b reads, "And Joseph went out over the land of Egypt." 46a says, "And Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt." Then we go back to the E narrative, and Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and passed through all the land of Egypt, basically repeating what was in 45a. The language in verse 49, "And Joseph piled up grain like the sand of the sea," sounds like covenantal language, and we've heard with Abram and Isaac and Jacob prior to this. It's also associated with Joseph's own progeny in the next few verses. So we go on with 50 through 52. "And so Joseph's 2 sons were born. And to Joseph 2 sons were born before the coming of the year of the famine, when Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bore him. And Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, meaning God has released me from all my hardship and all of my father's house. And the name of the second he called Ephraim, meaning God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction." Robert Alter says Manasseh means God has released me from all of the debt. Other commentaries suggest made me forget all my troubles. Alter thinks it's still somewhat odd or strange that Joseph should celebrate God for having made him forget his father's house, but he still includes that as part of the name. God has released me from my debt also parallels better made me fruitful, which is the name of Ephraim. Go on with 53 through 57. "And the 7 years of plenty that had been in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said, and there was famine in all the lands. But in the land of Egypt there was bread, and all the land of Egypt was hungry. And the people cried out to Pharaoh for bread, and Pharaoh said to all of Egypt, 'Go to Joseph. What he says to you, you must do.' And the famine was over all the land. And Joseph laid open whatever had grain within, and sold provisions to Egypt. And the famine grew harsh in the land of Egypt. And all the earth came to Egypt, to Joseph, to get provisions, for the famine had grown harsh in all the earth." Verse 54 ends with, "In the land of Egypt there was bread," which contrasts with the start of 55, "and all the land of Egypt was hungry." There is food to be had, but you had to go to Joseph to get it, and you pay a price for that. So it's there. Joseph is taken from the pit to Egypt, where he is seduced by Potiphar's wife, then thrown into another pit, the prison. But like a phoenix rising from the ashes, Joseph interprets a few dreams and becomes perhaps the most powerful man in all of Egypt. Joseph's ability to interpret or solve dreams is the first time in the 5 books of Moses that a human possesses a divine power. We also note that something else has changed in Joseph. At the beginning of his story, he didn't appear to be aware of the prophetic importance of his own dreams. He thought it was a big joke that his brothers might bow down to him. But now he is able to interpret the dreams of others, including the dreams of Pharaoh, affecting the destiny of countries and of his own family. Next week, we read chapters 42, 43, and 44. In the midst of famine, the sons of Israel come to Egypt to get food. Joseph, who they do not recognize, gives them food, but tells them to come back with their youngest brother Benjamin. There is more deception, more fear, and until finally Joseph hits his breaking point. Until then, be safe. We hope to see you Wednesday.